Boa tarde, good afternoon, boa tarde. Tenho a honra de ter aqui na nossa faculdade, como convidado, o professor Michael Moore, de Illinois, e cujo currículo é conhecido, enfim, mas poderei realçar. I'm talking about your bio. He knows.
I know it.
O professor Michael Moore tem uma obra notável no campo do direito criminal e da filosofia do direito. Tem uma cátedra que, aliás, na Universidade de Illinois é uma cátedra tripla que abrange a área do direito, da filosofia do direito e estudos avançados. A sua obra, ela também passou por outras faculdades, como poderão ver, indo à internet e, portanto, ao currículo dele, portanto, com também lugares de grande prestígio nos Estados Unidos. É considerado um dos mais importantes especialistas, não só em direito criminal, como em filosofia do direito, e sobretudo na interseção entre a filosofia do direito e o direito criminal, e tem tratado daqueles problemas que são centrais no pensamento do direito, não só do direito criminal, mas que ele trata a partir do direito criminal. Desde a sua obra Art and Crime até às obras sobre causalidade e, nomeadamente, ao livro que ele aqui tem, que é o Mechanical Choices, esse é muito recente, 2022, são mais de 100 livros e um conjunto enormíssimo de artigos, desde questões como Direito e Psiquiatria, foi uma das obras mais antigas, até, portanto, matéria relacionada com a responsabilidade moral e com, portanto, placing blame, enfim, muitas áreas, sempre dentro desta vertente primária do direito penal. Antes de fazer uma pequena introdução à obra dele, eu vou dar a palavra a uma outra convidada, que é a professora Sara Xapelli, a qual, sendo bióloga, neste momento faz parte da comissão executiva de um dos colégios, dos poucos colégios da Universidade de Lisboa, o Colégio Mente Cérebro, em que a Faculdade de Direito está representada também, e outras faculdades tanto da Universidade de Lisboa, e portanto temos também muito prazer em a ter entre nós e de lhe dar a oportunidade de divulgar também esse projeto importante, esse projeto científico interdisciplinar, aliás, muito importante, que é o Colégio Mente Cérebro. Portanto, eu iria primeiro passar a palavra à professora Sara Xapelli, depois ainda retomaria, se me permitirem, a palavra para fazer uma pequena introdução à obra, portanto, ao pensamento do professor Michael Moore, num texto que ele também tem em inglês e que eu portanto, lerei em português. Tenho a palavra, professora Sara. Muito obrigada por ter vindo.
Olá, boa tarde. É realmente um prazer estar aqui em representação do Colégio Mente Cérebro. Eu sou Sara Xapelli e trabalho na Faculdade de Medicina, aqui na Universidade de Lisboa. Eu vou fazer uma muito pequena apresentação, vou fazer em inglês só para ser inclusiva. Okay? So, switching to English. So this Mind Brain College was created in 2015 and is now it has 9 schools from University of Lisbon, and you can see that here the Faculty of Law is included, but you have the Faculty of Science, Language, Psychology and Medicine, so these 9 schools, and this is really our goal, is to even increase the number of schools in our college. And so these are today our board members, so this was really changed. So this was our Mind Brain College was very active between 2015 and 2019, but then, you know, COVID came and this was very, very inactive. And we reassumed last year, in the end of last year, so we are starting again, and this is the new executive commission, and also we have also a PhD students commission. So we really want the students to be involved and to give ideas on how to improve our mind-brain college. So the goal of our mind-brain is to involve the society. Okay, so this is very, very important for us. And we go from the ion, so really small level till cognition. Okay, so going through all these from this, looking at really small molecules until the cognition state. And we have this challenge, so social challenge and technological challenge. You know, you have been talking a lot about artificial intelligence. So this is also very, very important in the mind-brain college. And we want to connect more and more University of Lisbon. And so start to have this amazing campus in which we can have different views of the same subject. So looking at the mind and brain. And you can see here some areas that connects all these mind and brain college. So what are our objectives from our mind-brain college? It's to promote networking. So here I am trying to promote networking and try to have this opportunity, implement common strategies, so look at different areas, but have common strategies, foster international partnerships. So as you know, this is very important. More and more, this funding is an issue, and more partnerships and cooperation is very important. Increase the competitiveness of University of Lisbon, also increase the visibility of our university in different sectors. And so this is really our objectives. And regarding our expect results, what we expect with this mind-brain college, as you probably, if you think about other universities all over the world, this college, they already happen, and they are really working together, okay? And so what we expect is to increase this transdisciplinary scientific activity in the mind-brain, to increase the capacity to attract national and foreign doctoral students in this area, increase the ability to attract also more funding to our different labs, and also, and this is very important, to increase the societal impact of the knowledge that is created by us. So for example, here, this conference is very important, and it has a societal impact. So I just want to show you this. This is something that I built yesterday, this bibliometric analysis. So I Googled it, not Google, but I found it in the Web of Knowledge from Mind and Brain with the keywords, and from the University of Lisbon, including technical. And you can see that while the Mind-Brain College was an active period, it was increasing, and then it stabilized, and now it's decreasing, okay? This is something that we are seeing in other, even in other areas. And we know that I think we got a peak in around the COVID area when we had a lot of publications. And we want to change again this, and to increase the number of publications, not at least increase, or to maintain the number of publications, good publications, and also to have this, and you can see here also the cumulative citations were increasing. We have a really big step here, and then now it's maintaining, okay? We want to have this going and growing. And so finally, I want to show you this previous event. So we were organizing every year the students' meeting. So this is just for you. So this was the first one organized in 2015. We received Professor Antonio Damasio, and this was really the kickoff, and we had a lot of people very interested. And we will have the opportunity to have this again. So this was very active, and it was very interesting because we have really so different areas of the mind and brain, so everybody could learn from different students. And so this is to show you, so save the date. So this is the first announcement of our mind-brain meeting. It will be in Reitoria in the 22nd to 26th of November. So please join us and feel free to be present and to participate. I think we really want to engage more and more, and especially the law school, we want to have you on board with us. And to become a member, you can scan the QR code, or you can also we have a new website that we also built. So if you want to join this college, you just need to scan or go to this and send an email to become a member. And thank you.
for your invitation to be member. We are already, and law faculty is already, but everybody, single person,
Yes,
could,
single persons
can be
members.
also members. I have only here two pages, is what I gave you, it's there. And therefore, Professor is not excluded from my, my presentation, but I will read in Portuguese. O que torna a responsabilidade moral mistério é o facto de os seus pilares serem incompatíveis com o conhecimento já proporcionado pela neurociência e a linguagem da neurociência ter sido incapaz de traduzir bem a ética e o direito. Por outro lado, também a ética e o direito não conseguem facilmente deixar de ser desafiados pela neurociência. Podemos desvalorizar a experiência de Libet, segundo a qual se torna pelo menos problemático dizer que a consciência é causal, ou que não é mais do que um epifenómeno. No entanto, é impossível deixar de reconhecer que aquilo que aceitávamos anteriormente como axioma se tornou um problema e mesmo algo de paradoxal. Algo não funciona nos mesmos termos em que previamente o aceitávamos. Ou a consciência é apenas um reflexo de um autónomo comportamento do corpo-cérebro e tem uma outra função que não a de determinar em si o comportamento, pondo em causa a justificação da responsabilidade, ou se ainda pudermos perspectivar como causal, se a consciência será na medida em que serve para modificar ou corrigir e não tanto para explicar. Michael Moore, na sua obra, dedica-se a uma análise lógica sistemática do significado das interpelações da neurociência, mostrando como o reducionismo, mas também o determinismo causal dos estados mentais são inconsistentes, abrindo-nos a porta para uma outra compreensão do mistério da responsabilidade, cuja solução passaria pelo confronto com um mundo possível alternativo, próximo ou longínquo, em que os nossos comportamentos poderiam ter sido diferentes. A neurociência conjugada com a filosofia permite perceber que onde havia um axioma e certeza, passará a haver uma desordem e um mistério por solucionar. Haverá provavelmente uma causalidade real da pessoa e da sua vontade e outra imaginária que nem sempre coincidirão, como demonstra Wegener, e a responsabilidade precisará talvez se apoiar na convergência das duas, verificada por terceiros. O mistério da responsabilidade está, porém, sobretudo na necessidade de, em certa medida, mantermos as nossas intuições e experiência pessoal. Como se explica essa necessidade? Não assenta essa necessidade em premissas erradas? Não teremos de rever os pontos de partida? A nossa responsabilidade não poderá estar associada, sobretudo, às possibilidades do futuro, de modificação do comportamento e menos do passado? Como escolhemos e porque escolhemos uma certa configuração do mundo? Somos todos escolhidos, como parece dizer-nos Primo Levi, quando admite que os guardas dos campos de concentração, tal como as vítimas e os das zonas cinzentas, não seriam senão uma manifestação da lógica darwinista que levaria a separar os mais capazes dos que seriam menos capazes e, por isso, as vítimas perfeitas? Se quem sobreviveu ao Holocausto diz isso, aceitando que o campo de concentração seria apenas a exposição, na versão cruel e mais real do mundo vulgar, cotidiano, em que os esqueletos estão escondidos, deixa ter sentido tanto a responsabilidade como o perdão. No entanto, se o perdão é uma necessidade existencial para os culpados e também para as vítimas, como recusá-lo? Como aceitar que poderemos renovar continuamente os campos de extermínio e virmos a ser vítimas ou carrascos? Escolhemos a configuração do mundo como produto de ações de pessoas suficientemente livres, porque precisamos de ultrapassar os campos de morte e de indignidade humana, e não há forma de os ultrapassar senão através da misteriosa responsabilidade. Enfim, é sobre este mistério da responsabilidade, esta discussão que a neurociência nos traz, e não só, a filosofia renova acerca do papel de nós mesmos, do papel da vontade, do papel da liberdade, da possibilidade da liberdade, que nos vai falar o professor Michael Moore. Professor Michael Moore, it is, as I said before, an honor for the Law Faculty of Lisbon and the University of Lisbon to have you as a distinguished guest. And after my brief introduction as, for me, the mystery of responsibility, something that is not completely solved and clear, I will give you the floor with a lot of pleasure.
Good. Thank you very much, both of you. Thank you all for coming. It's good to be back in Lisbon again. It's been about 8 years. City looks splendid as always. On the remarks with regard to the center and the institute that Professor Palma is a part of, and also the mind-brain interdisciplinary, I really am pleased to be in both of these institutions. I've either run or founded 5 of them myself over a long career at different universities, and I regularly visit them as well. I'm a great believer in these kinds of interdisciplinary research activities. It's how we learn a good deal more quickly than you can do it by yourself. So very pleased to be here. I want to thank Professor Palma for basically selling my topic for me. Namely, she finds the challenge to the mental states on which responsibility is based, and thus the law that's based on that responsibility, both being challenged by contemporary neuroscience. Namely, it's something of a mystery how those two things go together. There's a spate of books about them. I start my own book, Mechanical Choices, Oxford Press, 2020, available at all good booksellers, but not yet in paperback, so it's still quite expensive. I start my own book with Francis Crick, the geneticist in the early 90s who published this book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. And if I speak too fast, raise your hand or say something. Once the hour gets going, I tend to speak faster and faster. In any event, Francis Crick, one of the many people I could have quoted, starts out saying, the astonishing hypothesis is that you, that is the thing you refer to when you use the word I, yourself, your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. You're nothing but a pack of neurons. Now that's just the tip of the iceberg of the kind of literature that it's either neuroscientists or popularizers of neuroscience have been doing the last 3 decades. One of my colleagues from years ago at Stanford, Bob Sapolsky, has a new book out called Determined. That's just last year, 2017, it was Behave, and 20 years before that, it was some speeches in London, all of them arguing that in light of neuroscience, criminal responsibility as we know it will disappear. Now, I've always thanked Bob because he actually sold that to the MacArthur Foundation in New York years ago, and they funded this $15 million research project that I've been a part of called the Law and Neuroscience Research Project. Bob hoped that we would reform criminal law. My job is to make sure that we demystify the apparent mystery so that we don't reform it in the directions that these neuroscientists would like. If you've read Sam Harris's book on free will, or the guy that preceded me at the Penn Neuroscience Center, Eagleson, even one of my own students, Peter Alces from Illinois, has written this book by Oxford about how neuroscience will undermine criminal law. It's a very hot topic. And one of the purposes of this book, along with my friends like Adina Roski, Dan Dennett, and others, is to defuse the apparent challenge. One of the people I worked closely with was Mike Gazzaniga, the director of the center, Sage Center for the Study of the Human Mind at University of California, Santa Barbara. And Mike used to say to me, we are going to bury you. And then he said, we're going to own you. The first line was Nikita Khrushchev. You're not old enough to remember that, but at the United Nations, Khrushchev said that to the United States. What did Gazzaniga mean? He meant once neuroscience fully explains the behavior that law regulates, we, that is lawyers, will become kind of a branch of neuroscience. I'm here to make sure that doesn't happen. I like my job, and I don't think it's a branch. We do have a very strong neuroscience program at the University of Illinois. While we're talking about mind-brain programs, we have about 60 full-time PhD students in neuroscience at the Beckman Institute for the Study of Advanced Science. One of the lectures I regularly give there is part and parcel of what I'm going to talk about today, which is even if you're a dyed-in-the-wool laboratory neuroscientist, if one of the topics you want to study is something like whether we truly have the capacity to control ourselves, you have to not only be able to do the neuroscience, but you also need the kind of philosophy that analyzes what capacities in general are and which sort of capacities there have to be to have the kind of freedom, as Dennett used to call it, that's worth wanting, the kind of freedom that makes you responsible. Anyway, that's the sales pitch for the talk. The challenges, actually, that are issued to the law and the mental states on which it is based are older than neuroscience, but they were based on a science that I think is less persuasive than contemporary cognitive neuroscience. I started my career taking on Freudian psychoanalytic theory back in the 60s. Freud, too, often said things like, our choices are simply epiphenomenal with the underlying psychic determinants in the unconscious. That mental health is actually an expansive term that covers all of ethics, that the repressed unconscious is really in charge and determines through his psychic determinism principle your behavior, that yourself is divided, that you are actually a corporation rather than a unitary self. There were a number of challenges that formed my first book back in 1984 on the Freudian challenges. There were also, if you remember the history of psychology and law, there was also very fashionable when B.F. Skinner was writing The Behaviorist Challenge to the Law, which also talked about environmental determiners, about how choices were epiphenomenal, not of brain events, but rather of stimulus in the environment. That was going to move us, if you remember the title of his famous book, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. Like contemporary neuroscientists of the ones that I've just mentioned, Fred Skinner as well was someone who thought the law would be left behind by the advancing science of psychology. So what's new with neuroscience? The neuroscientists actually have, I think, a better science than either psychoanalysis or radical behaviorism could promise, in which event the challenges that issue from their science, even if not different than those of the psychologies that preceded them, seem to be having more bite on the public psyche. So it's worth having a public debate with regard to whether or not these are real challenges or not. Here's the four things I'd like to talk about, probably in decreasing order as the time diminishes. One is what's being challenged. What exactly is it that neuroscience, along with its preceding psychologies, is challenging? Two, what's the data that does the challenging? What is it that neuroscientists have discovered, or at least what is that slice of that vast range of things that they've discovered that seems to challenge responsibility? Three, can we isolate more discriminately what kind of challenges there are? I gave the general quote from Francis Crick, but I think there are four distinct challenges that issue from viewpoints like his, which I'll try to separate for you. I will also try to give you what I regard as two quite different ways of answering those challenges, and that's what basically organizes the book. It's an 8-cell division of discussion. And then fourth and lastly, how do things stand? I usually, if the lecture is short, simply say, well, that's why you have to read the book. You'll need to buy it and read it. But I'll see if I can give you a preview of this 600-page answer to why these challenges aren't as challenging as they seem. So that's the program. The first thing is what's being challenged. I like the title. It was Professor Palma's title of this talk because it's about the mental states, as she puts it, that are being challenged. And that's the right way to see the way neuroscience is challenging the law. It's at 3 levels of challenge. It challenges the law itself, or at least that part of the law that I call justice-based institutions. Now, as you know, most areas of law have more than one theory as to what they're really about. Bentham and the economists of the 21st century both shared a view a utilitarian point of view to which neuroscience may make a challenge, but it's not this one. It's not based on the kind of responsibility and agency that's required for the other kinds of legal institutions that I do think are challenged. Namely, what I call justice-oriented institutions, prominently including retributive theories of criminal law, that we punish people because and only because they are blameworthy and deserve to be punished. Immanuel Kant and all those forward from there. Certainly one of the kinds of ways of looking at law challenged in its thought by contemporary neuroscience. But look, even mixed theories of punishment, H.L.A. Hart at Oxford in the 60s, where you limit punishment by the desert of the offender, that also is challenged, because you can no more use desert to limit an offense than to motivate its punishment if desert itself doesn't exist, because neuroscience has shown that agency doesn't exist. So that form, but also natural right theories of property, promissory theories of contract, natural right theories of the Constitution. All of those are based on certain views about what agents do and what they deserve in light of what they do. Those are all in contrast to forward-looking areas of law, utilitarianism and the modern welfare economics view, which says liability rules are arranged to incentivize optimal behavior. That's a different way in looking at law that is much less challenged by neuroscience. And many neuroscientists ultimately opt for that way of looking at law because they think that's compatible with the neuroscience. What has to go is the Kantian way of looking at it, where legal liability is based on backward-looking considerations of how agency was exercised, and therefore what kind of sanctions, good or bad, positive or negative, people deserve because of that way of exercising agency. So legal institutions, first and foremost. The ones that interest me are second level, based on a notion of moral responsibility. Now, usually when you say moral responsibility, people think of substantive moral notions like abortion is good or abortion is bad, killing is good, killing is bad, whatever. The kind of morality on which the criminal law particularly is based, but all justice institutions are based, is what starts in Book 3 of the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle. It is the view that there is an agency of human beings which, however the content of morality might be arranged, determines when it's fair to both praise and blame people. Joe Raz at Oxford used to call that ascriptive morality. Some people call it hypological morality. The only important point is to see these are the conditions of fair fault ascription. Whatever substantive moral notions are in play, and thus whatever substantive criminal prohibitions are in play, irrespective of that, there is a morality of when we can fairly blame people, and thus, if you're a retributivist, punish them for their blameworthy nature. Those are, as I say, the second level, moral responsibility. But both justice-based legal institutions, the first level, and moral responsibility, the second level, depend crucially on the third level, which is usually called the folk psychology. The folk psychology on which ordinary people understand each other and appraise each other in everyday life. So when you came to this lecture, my guess is that you came because you wanted to know something about the interaction of neuroscience and law. You believed this guy from Illinois might know something, and therefore you might learn something if you came. So you had a desire that motivated you at a set of cognitive beliefs in light of which you could figure out how to get what you wanted. You therefore formed the intention to come, and you therefore came because of that intention. That's a BDI, belief, desire, intention psychology, which is the heart of the folk psychology on which the law is based. It's as old as Aristotle and as modern artificial intelligence divisions by functions. In any event, that psychology is the one that's challenged by neuroscience. In my book, I try to subdivide that. A lot of the history of Western philosophy is built into the suppositions of that psychology. Things like intentionality from the scholastics of the Middle Ages, revived by Charles Brentano in the 19th century, namely how many, not all, mental states are directed upon an object. That is, we represent the world in a certain way. That there are three states, Plato's tripartite division of the soul, of particular relevance to this representational capacity. Namely, we represent the world as we believe it is, as we want it to be, and as we intend to make it. the three attitudes that give us control of the world. Those three states are ordered in the way that since Aristotle we've called valid practical syllogisms, namely the content have to relate to each other in a certain rational way. And most importantly, they also have to be causally efficacious, David Hume's point. It has to be the case to have control of the world that you can cause it at least sometimes to instantiate the objects of your intentions. That's what we mean by having control of certain parts of the world. You can actually make it become what you intend it to be. If you have those states plus consciousness, emotionality, character structure, and some other things, you have moral agency. That's the folk psychology challenged in various of its aspects by neuroscience. So I said I was going to do four things. That's the first. What's challenged? The law, the morality that underlies the law, and the psychology that underlies both the folk psychology. So what kind of data has neuroscience produced? It's a vast, vast array. What kind of data that neuroscience has produced have been relied on by skeptics or mysterians about responsibility? Well, I parse it into three clumps of data, with apologies to the extraordinary amount of neuroscience not discussed. One clump of data is the data that has to do with the physical nature of presumably the world and even our mental states, the mind-brain relationship. Namely, the amount of data that deals with how in some way mental states are intimately related to brain states. Human actions are intimately related to certain physical goings-on in the world that lie behind our bodily movements by which we execute actions. Now, how those are characterized is something I'll mention in just a moment, but the first sort of thing is just to see the kinds of experiments and data on which it's based. I mean, almost every abnormal psychology textbook in America starts out with Phineas Gage, the railroad worker. I gave this lecture actually at Dartmouth a few years ago. Turns out Phineas Gage was injured 30 miles from the Dartmouth University campus in 1848. I didn't know that fact. Anyway, he was a railroad foreman who was using a tamping bar, which is about a 4-foot metal bar, to tamp down the railroad tracks on which he was working. And there was an explosive inside the track that he didn't know about that blew the bar up through his chin and out through his left eye, taking a good bit of his left frontal lobe with it. Very demonstrable mental changes as described by his treating doctor, namely when he was before the tamping bar incident, a very organized person who regularly maintained his intentions and his business. Afterwards was sporadic, couldn't focus, couldn't do what he intended to do, and had a short temper and a vocabulary that he had not used before in swearing. He was, in other words, quite a changed human being. As one of his companions said, he's no longer Gage. That's often used to start the discussion of there has to be some intimate relation between the mental states of intention and control that Gage illustrated before his accident and the brain states that he had then but didn't have after the accident, when those mental states, along with the brain states, changed. The kind of research since then has been numerous. One of the cases we mention a lot happened at the University of Virginia while I was teaching there in the late 90s. Mr. Ott, 40-year-old school teacher, had a right orbital frontal tumor. That usually means you do things like pee your pants and don't write very well. But in his case, it was plausible it actually caused pedophilic desires with regard to inappropriate touching of young women. We think that's the case, Archives of General Neurology, because when they studied him, he had no such interest in pornography, no such behavior, no such reported urges prior to the tumor. After the tumor's presence, he did. When the tumor was removed, he didn't. When it reappeared, he did. And when it was removed again, he didn't. So a strong case the neurologist made that the tumor caused the desires that led him to criminal court because he did inappropriate touching of his 14-year-old prepubescent stepdaughter. So he's in for sexual assault, and the question is he guilty? Is he morally guilty and is thus liable to any kind of deserved punishment, right? That's the science of his desire seems to be linked to this tumor in some way that we don't understand. I want to come back to him when I talk about what kind of a challenge to responsibility there is. Just one more example of the mind-brain correlation. One of the things we did with all that neuroscience research money that the MacArthur Foundation gave us, Tony Rangel, one of my colleagues at the Caltech labs, did experiments with regard to dieters' ability to control their dieting. If you get them really hungry, present them with a healthy and an unhealthy food choice, and then put them in a scanner to see which they choose. What Tony and his colleagues found, Science 2009 and then replicated many times since, what he found was that actually if the dieter was hungry and they really liked what we put in front of them, some chocolate cake, then it was the case the ventromedial prefrontal cortex became quite full of oxygenated blood. It gave us a strong signal of activity. But the dieters divided into two camps, those that chose to eat the cake and those that chose to stay on the diet. Now, you can't eat in a scanner, but they could get whatever they wanted whenever they got out of the scanner. Those who actually chose to eat the cake, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was quiet, did not actually interrupt the signal coming from the ventromedial. Those who actually chose not to eat the cake had a very active dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, from which Tony's hypothesis. The dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has something to do with the mental states of control with regard to gluttonous desires, at least those that have to do with food. So lots of data about some intimate relation between brain states and both mental experience and mental states experienced. There's also, of course, even older data, 100 years of it, on the neuroscience of voluntary motor movement. 100 years ago, Sir Charles Sherrington, for which he won the Nobel Prize, charted how it is human beings in their voluntary motor movements operate with the pairs of muscles that are paired against each other, flexors and extensors, and how those with their two kinds of signals down and back to the brain actually operate through both the common motor pathway and the two upper motor pathways. His former student, Sir John Eccles, where I taught for a while at ANU, also winning the Nobel Prize, continued that work charting the supplementary motor area, out of which you get a real picture of the intimate relationship between the mechanics of human movement and what we call human actions for which we're responsible. Now, part of that intimate relationship is due to the philosophy of action since a philosopher named Donald Davidson in the 60s. Namely, every human action, no matter how various its description, is at bottom a bodily movement. Bodily movements are the Archimedean levers by which we move the world. Start there and then ask, but a voluntary motor movement, what does that have? And the Sherrington-Eccles physiology does indeed make us look a lot like what John Stuart Mill describes in his book on liberty. We look like steam shovels. Namely, everything can be mechanically explained once the signals get started from the brain. So as I say in the book, there's two sets of intimate relations that seem particularly relevant to the challenge to responsibility. One is the relation of mental states like belief, desires, and intention that allow us to decide what to do, and brain states. And the other is the relation between voluntary motor movements and the actions that we do to change the world. Both of those seem to have this intimate relationship I call physicalism, leaving open exactly what that relationship is. There are quite a few variations as to how you conceive of that relation. Let me make it simple. Two variations that are particularly relevant. One is the reductionist, and that itself has various flavors. Classical reductionism in the science is a thesis that the explanation of the higher science can reduce the explanations of the lower science in the sense that it will deductively imply but not be implied by them. So that's a logical relation between statements of a theory, usually called epistemological reduction. Such reductions are possible because of another kind of reduction, namely not between statements. It's not the equivalence or the material implication between statements. It's rather the identity of the things stated about. so that there's an identity between one entity and another. The old example Ernst Nagel used in the philosophy of science was the reduction of classical thermodynamics to statistical mechanics. All the stuff we learned in middle school about Charles' law and Boyle's law, Snell's law about the diffusion rate of molecules through a porous membrane, what are called the ideal gas laws. All of us had those experiments in lower school with regard to that. Nagel, you can show those laws to be the deductive implications of simply the kinetic energy of molecules in motion. In which event, if you understand the higher science in terms of statistical mechanics, you will understand why it's the case that Boyle's law, Charles' law, and so forth all have to be true. They are simply the deductive implications. Now, that only works because some of the terms of those laws, like temperature, are nothing but, to paraphrase Francis Crick, they are nothing but the kinetic energy of molecules, in which event the identity of the things the theories are about allows the deducibility of one theory to another. That's classic reductionism. It's been amended many times without giving you all the details, without losing its reductive flavor. So there's classical reductionism where a theory is reduced to another. Now, often classed with classical reductionism is something called eliminative materialism. It's still physicalism. The world is still at bottom physicalistic. There's brain states. The difference is that the eliminativist is someone who thinks the mental state psychology won't survive. There's an explanatory competition going on between the brain sciences and psychology that is framed in terms of the folk psychological terms of belief, desire, intention, emotion, and the like, and the latter will lose out to the former. Thus the name. It's a materialism, but it's eliminative. The neuroscientists aren't the first kid on the block with this view. This was Fred Skinner's view when he used to come to my seminars at Harvard. The mental states will wither away because of their methodological inferiority to what he thought were his SR patterns of explanation. Neuroscience. The mental states will wither away and die as they lose out in an explanatory competition to better explanations in terms of brain states, usually called, as I said, eliminative materialism. So two very different views. Notice one of them is reductionist, the other is anti-reductionist, but eliminativist. Those are quite different views. It's sort of an amazing oddball in the history of science that they go hand in hand because they're both physicalist views. Anyway, that's one clump of data, the intimate relation of mind and brain. Second clump of data is one that was mentioned by Professor Palma. It came out of German research in the mid-60s by two individuals, Dieck and Kornhuber, at Albert Ludwigs Universität in Freiburg in Breisgau. They found in 1965 this thing they call the Bereitschaft potential, usually translated into English as the readiness potential, that preceding all voluntary motor movement in human beings is a slow negative shift in the voltage potential measured by EEG at the top of the vertex of the skull for planned movements about a second prior to initiation of the signal hitting the motor plates, but for unplanned and uncued movements, only about a half a second. But nonetheless, consistently, some physical goings-on manifested by a slow negative shift in voltage potential, the readiness potential. That was heralded when it was taken to be paired with consciousness studies by Benjamin Libet, a researcher at the University of California, San Francisco. Libet's interest had always been in consciousness studies. What he did was pair the German result with his own consciousness research by asking the subjects to watch a revolving clock and date the time when they had the onset of their decision, intention, willingness to move their finger. And he would measure that time vis-a-vis the readiness potential that he could also measure with EEG patterns from the vertex of the skull. And no surprise, the EEG patterns, the readiness potential, occurred prior to the onset of any consciousness of willing, in which event, Libet, it looks like something's going on in the brain, or to put it animistically, the brain decides before you decide what it is you're going to do, right? it's animistic because that's exactly how Freud used to put it, right? There's a second will operating behind your will. Drop the animism. There's some kind of physical cause going on that you don't know about and do not control that determines both whether you will the movement of your finger and whether the finger moves. Now that has been continued. One of my colleagues that I comment on his work, John Dylan Haynes at Berlin, at the time he did his work in 2007, 2008 in the precuneus region of the parietal cortex, he came to Santa Barbara and we had a discussion about what he had found. What he had found was this: much further back than Libet, 7 to 10 seconds prior to the initiation of voluntary motor movement, in his one experiment. In the other case, it was mental actions of adding and subtracting. But in either case, 7 to 10 seconds prior to the motor movement, there were measurable goings on, measuring the oxygenated blood flow patterns in the certain regions of the parietal cortex. He got to about 70% predictive accuracy in being able to predict on a two-valued choice which choice the brain had made that much earlier. That was well before any conscious awareness of what that choice was going to be by the acting subject, extending the kind of Libet challenge to much earlier in the brain, to what psychologists often call the distal intentions rather than the immediate intention to move your finger with which Libet was dealing. There's two ways to think of these results. One is as a simple causal chain. Namely, these brain events go on in the parietal cortex or in the supplementary motor area of the brain, Haynes, Libet, and they cause a conscious awareness of an intention to move, and that causes the movement. In which event, the willing is not epiphenomenal of the movement, but it's part of the causal chain and is caused. The other and more radical interpretation is the epiphenomenal interpretation. Namely, what is caused by these events in the brain, parietal cortex, supplementary motor area, is the movement itself. They also and separately cause an awareness of a desire to move, a willingness to move, a willing to move. They cause that kind of willingness, but the willingness itself doesn't cause anything. It's an epiphenomenal dangler, in which event, although you think you're controlling it with your choice actually is simply the co-effect of a common cause of what's really causing your behavior, which is what's going on in the brain, the epiphenomenal interpretation. That sounds really challenging to notions of responsibility, which I think it is. Third set of data is the data that came out, I noticed also mentioned by Professor Palma, book 2002 called The Illusion of Conscious Will by a Harvard psychologist, Daniel Legner. What Legner charted, well, Legner's book is always misunderstood, as he himself knew it would be when he chose the title. He apologizes in his symposium later on that the title, as he said, is a fighting title that he shouldn't have used, because it makes it sound like he's reiterating the kind of Libet challenges with regard to the lack of causal power of will. It's not what he's doing. His book is about the epistemic access, our ability to know what's going on. He's part of what is self-proclaimed the psychologist of the new unconscious, new because it's not Freudian, none of that repressed stuff. But nonetheless, it is about the unconscious determinants of action that you don't have access to. The claim is to be responsible is to have knowledge, and we don't have the knowledge we think we have. So it's an epistemic skepticism. He performed a set of experiments, both what he called the automaticity of everyday life, the alien hand syndrome, where the hand goes up, old film, Dr. Strangelove goes up in a Nazi salute. The alien hand syndrome, where there is seemingly voluntary behavior, but the subject doesn't experience it as voluntary. And then there's the converse cases, the illusion of control cases, where the subject thinks he's controlling something, but isn't. Performs this children's game called I Spy, where you have an experimenter very cleverly follow the retinal patterns of the subject, and whenever they pick something, you make it move. They'll think that they've got magical abilities after a while that they're making it move. It's the illusion of control. Wegner, we don't have nearly the knowledge we think we have about what it is we're doing and why. And without knowledge, drops out responsibility. So 3 senses of data. Now, the challenges from the data, the third thing I wanted to talk about. The challenges from the data I divide into 4 parts, even though it comes from 3 sets of data. It's the Libet example that gives you both of these. 3 kinds of challenges 4 kinds of challenges that I think arise from the data. One is the challenge of physicalism, the challenge that says we are at bottom nothing but machines. That seems to make people skeptical. I mentioned John Stuart Mill, his book on liberty, 1859. He says human beings, if they are simply parroting others' opinions, are no more of value than a steam engine, his example, right? If we're merely machines, the worry is somehow we lose whatever it is that makes us the special creatures who can be moral agents, both praised and blamed. So what is it about physicalism that's challenging in this way? Well, one of the variations, remember, is reductionism. You're nothing but your brain states. Why doesn't that make you more confident about the mental states on which you base your decisions? So I was giving this lecture at Northwestern years ago to a number of skeptics, and I said, I don't know much about glaciation, but look out the window and there's Lake Michigan sitting out there. I said, now let me tell you the causes of that lake in terms of the glaciation during the Ice Age, the scooping out of, my geology is limited, so it's a really short lecture, and the rainfall patterns of Central America. I said, now, I've explained the lake to you in terms of its causal antecedents. Take another look. Is the lake still there? To the guy I was actually questioning, I think the lake disappeared. He was so pissed off at my horsey ducky approach, he walked out of the room. So his back was to the lake. But the point was this: you got to think choices are really something special if they disappear by virtue of showing you their physical nature. It takes some real argument to establish what is it that would make it so challenging to reveal that your pain is a certain physical state and not just a phenomenologically experienced one, that your desires are the same, and so forth. I try in my book to isolate 3 kinds of arguments, and here I'm trying to place myself in the skeptic's mind because I actually don't find it easy. One of my colleagues in Munich, whose book, Why Free Will is Real, Christian List, 2019, has the same problem. What is it, as he sees, what is it that people think is so challenging about reductionism? Now, one possibility is that you think the thing reduced is just a second-class citizen in your ontology of all the things that exist, right? Do you think that about temperature? It's fully reducible to the average kinetic energy of the molecules of a gas. But does that mean in any way that it doesn't exist or that it's some second-class citizen? Why doesn't that just give you more confidence about what temperature is? Reductions are 2-way streets. If temperature is identical to kinetic energy of molecules, kinetic energy of molecules of a gas is identical to temperature. They both exist. Why is there any sort of worry about second-class citizenship? So that seems a very odd thing to think. You keep looking for what else is challenging. Is it because we are intrinsically dualist? Not libertarian, think we have free will. Dualist. We really think with Descartes that we're the kind of ghosts that can throw things at people but can't get hit by them, the things that are physically impossible. Now, there's an article by a current member of the Israeli Supreme Court that defends this view, Alex Stein. Stein thinks somehow the law that he has to enforce in Israel, presupposes that we have this Cartesian dualist self that exists in time but not in space and can exhibit causal relations but isn't itself cause. If that were true, we would be in trouble. It would be amazing if it were true. It doesn't look like there's anything in our criminal law or the morality that underlies it or the folk psychology that underlies both that really makes it the case that we are dualists. So there's not that. So I end up in my book saying the real challenge is this one. The logician Saul Kripke used to call it skeptical reductions. Namely, if a reduction succeeds, but it leaves out what seemed essential to the thing reduced, then although it's a way of saying it really exists, what you really are saying is because it left out what you thought was essential, then it doesn't really exist. Kripke's example is causation. David Hume famously reduced causal relations to regular concurrence of events. Is David Hume a realist about causation or a skeptic? He's usually classed as a skeptic because he left out the cement, the making it happen stuff of causation. And if that's what's left out, it becomes a skeptical reduction. So the argument would have to be that by reducing mental states of belief, desire, intention, and the actions they cause into brain states and the bodily movements caused by those brain states, somehow those reductions leave out something essential. The burden is on those who show that, to say that, to show what exactly is it that is left out of this story. In any event, that's the challenge of physicalism in its reductionist guise. The challenge from eliminative materialism is very easy. If from Skinner to the contemporary Churchlands and others who think that mental state explanations will simply disappear and lose out to brain state explanations, or in Skinner's case, environmental explanations, if you think that, then indeed responsibility is in serious trouble. I quote Jerry Fodor for saying this would be the greatest intellectual disaster in the history of the human race. It would be absolutely amazing. Try it. Try thinking about yourself in terms other than using those belief, desire, intention things. I used to ask Fred Skinner when he'd come to my seminar at Harvard. So Fred, you wrote your first volume of your autobiography, Particulars of My Life, using mental state terms. How come? He said, it's just convenience. You guys wouldn't understand it if I used behavioral psychology. We invited the Churchlands to a conference as well, the contemporary eliminative materialists, and they do paraphrase, they're married, when Paul says to Patricia, instead of saying, I love you, he says, my amygdala is acting up. But that's a joke, right? That's just to translate what you know physically accompanies the emotion of love. It isn't really that you got rid of love, you simply reduced it. You didn't get rid of it. In any event, it's not easy to think how it could be the case that you can get rid of these items. If it were true, eliminative materialists would be a real challenge to responsibility. Anyway, that's the first challenge. The second challenge is the challenge that's even older than the physicalist challenge. That's the determinist challenge. That isn't the challenge that mind's mental states are identical or in some way reducible to brain states. It's the challenge that stems from the fact they're at least caused by physical states of the brain. And the challenge is as old as Hobbes. Anyone who is a materialist about the mind will face the challenge. Neuroscience just happens to have more data than Hobbes did, but it's the same challenge, to which the answers for centuries have been David Hume's answer. It's been, you've got to show more than simply that behavior is caused. What's crucial is to show that it's incompatible, that it's caused, with being responsible for it. And usually that's done in terms of what's called the principle of alternative possibilities. To be responsible for something is to have had the ability, the capacity to have done or chosen other than you did. And if something is sufficiently caused, the argument is you lack that capacity and that ability, and therefore that responsibility. So determinism, in the neuroscientist's hands, has the same challenge that it actually has had for a very long time, a challenge that goes back and forth. So I saw my friend Dan Dennett and I were sports partners. He died recently. His last public performance was with Bob Sapolsky. You can see it on YouTube. Sapolsky again and again shows you that brain states at least cause, if they aren't even identical to mental states. But Dennett and I and others concede that. What needs showing is that that is somehow a fact incompatible with responsibility. And on that, I'm afraid Robert Sapolsky is not very good. In any event, that's the challenge. The third challenge, the epiphenomenal challenge, is a really interesting one. That's the challenge that says not that you're caused in your choices and your voluntary bodily movements, it says they do no causing. One of the things even people like Hume, Dennett, and myself think you have to control the world is the ability to cause it to be in conformity with the objects that you have of your intentions. If you don't have that, you can't control the world. That's crucial. And you can't be responsible for it being good or bad. So we do need causal capacity. If what the Libet experiments and that of John Dillon Haynes show us is that our choices are epiphenomenal with the behavior chosen. They don't cause it, they just accompany it. If that's what it can show us, that looks like a real skepticism. Now, in the book, I try to go through 3 different versions of epiphenomenalism because this is a debate that's been going on for quite a while. It starts out this way. So Libet and his followers, 1985, Brains and Behavior, say what's epiphenomenal is the will itself, the intention. The will itself doesn't cause the object that it wills, it simply accompanies it. It's the co-effect of a common cause in the supplementary motor area of the brain. One response, 1985, Arthur Danto in The Philosophy of Action at Columbia, said, look, willing doesn't start with consciousness of willing. The mental state that is an intention or willing ramps up before you're aware of it. There should be no surprise about that. In which event there's no surprise whatsoever that there's a readiness potential prior to an experience of willing. So the neuroscientist's response is, okay, then what's epiphenomenal isn't the willing itself. What's epiphenomenal is consciousness of willing. So consciousness of willing now does no causing, even if the willing itself ramps up earlier. Consciousness of willing is when the person experiences it. To which certain students of consciousness say, well, wait a second, consciousness is just another brain process. It also takes real time, in which event it should be no surprise that it ramps up a half a second earlier either prior to experiencing it. That shouldn't be a surprise. That gives you the 3rd form of epiphenomenal skepticism. Namely, well, okay, so it's not consciousness itself, it's phenomenal awareness. That clearly only starts when Libet says it starts, which is when somebody thinks about it. That at least is epiphenomenal, is what the data is supposed to show. So we have 3 sorts of epiphenomenal challenges coming out of this back and forth by neuroscience, either willing itself, consciousness of willing, or phenomenal awareness of willing. One of those 3 is thought to be epiphenomenal, doing not the causing it's supposed to do to give us control of the world. 4th challenge, the Wagner challenge, the epistemic challenge. It is true. If you look at the philosophers who used to deal with Freud at his heyday in the 20s, they used to say things like, look, you can't have unconscious mental states because they wouldn't be mental states if you didn't have consciousness. It's a whole set of philosophy articles like that in the 1920s that I go through in my first book on Freud. That's surely not right. Surely not the case that mental states require consciousness in the sense of full phenomenal awareness. So Wagner has an easy target insofar as he's saying we don't have infallibility about our mental states. Descartes may have thought the only thing you can be certain of is your mind, but he was wrong about that, as about many other things. So we're not infallible. It's not that our mental states are transparent to us. If we're in pain, we know we're in pain. It's not that we're incorrigible in our beliefs. If we believe we're in pain, necessarily we're in pain. Neither of those 2 things is true, is the challenge Wagner, I think, rightly poses. But that's a modest challenge. He's got 2, I think, much more severe challenges. One is, it's not just that you're not infallible, it's that you're usually wrong. Namely, you're wrong about what you believe, desire, and intend. Now, that's kind of a big challenge. That means the conscious self that you identify with actually doesn't know what's going on, even in terms of the things it's supposed to most intimately control, which are your own choices. That looks pretty challenging. And the 3rd challenge is also a challenge. It is, and you don't have the special way of knowing what your mental states are that philosophers of mind for centuries have been claiming that you have. We all supposedly, Elizabeth Anscombe at Cambridge of a generation ago, we all supposedly have a non-observational, non-inferential way of saying straight off what it is that we intend, what it is that our mood is, and so forth. You can see the plausibility of that thought with the old behaviorist joke that you may have heard. One behaviorist greets another on the street, and he opens the conversation with, "You feel fine, how do I feel?" The only humor that comes out of that is the humor that we each seem to have better access to our own mental states than we have of others, and vice versa, in which event it looks like it's the case that we are in fact privileged in access. Wagner looks like he sometimes challenges that too. That looks like a real challenge, because part of how we identify ourselves as a self is through this mode of non-inferential knowledge. In my first book on Freud, I said that was his best insight, that we have an extended privilege access through free association. Okay, those are the kinds of challenges that come out of the book. One of my friends who died recently, taught moral philosophy at Cornell for many years, made the mistake of on Friday afternoons going to listen to his teaching assistant do his discussion sections with the lectures that he'd been giving in moral philosophy. And he found that his teaching assistant was dividing up his discussions of his lectures into two parts. The first half was, oh yeah, and the second half was, so what? And what he came to realize was that actually is a pretty good teaching assistant. He's got the two questions you really should ask about anything that seems to challenge you. One, of course, is it true? And the other is, does it have the implications somebody thinks it is? Every lawyer knows that, because you know when you file a pleading, you can either issue a general denial to the plaintiff's complaint, or you can do confession and avoidance, concede arguendo the truth of the complaint, but say nonetheless, because of new matter, it doesn't have the implications that you think it does. So that's the way you should respond to these challenges. Oh yeah, and so what? Is it true, and does it matter to responsibility whether it's true? That gives you, as I say, 8 cells of discussion, 4 challenges, 2 possible responses. I usually have just one of those 2 responses. It either isn't true or it doesn't matter. Once in a while, I have both, but not very often. So the fourth part of the book is to go through how things stand with each of those 4 challenges in terms of these 2 responses. I see that my time is limited, so I will reiterate my invitation for you. If you really want the answer, book is available at all good booksellers. It hasn't been translated yet into Portuguese, but perhaps it will be. So what do we do with these challenges? The physicalist challenge. The physicalist challenge, I think, is true. I'm a reductionist, not in the classical sense, but in a sense that I defend in the book that comes out of all the work that was done in the 80s and 90s in the philosophy of mind. So I'm a reductionist in some suitable sense of mental states are brain states. For the life of me, I can't make sense of any of the versions of why that makes somebody skeptical. I see that it does. I've gone through the ones like Alex Stein in Israel and others who think that it does. I nonetheless, I'm almost at a loss to make sense of why it would be, why it makes any difference to responsibility. So on that one, it seems to me it's true, it's just not challenging, or at least no one's yet articulated what it is about us being machines. But what else would we be? Ghosts? I mean, how could it possibly work that we are some kind of ghost who can cause things to happen but can't be caused? We live in this world where there's no energy and there's no sort of occupation of space, but nonetheless it takes time. That's unintelligible to me. In which event, yeah, I think physicalism is true, but it's not harmful. If eliminative materialism were true, if it really were the case that neuroscience would replace the folk psychology, I do believe responsibility and a lot else that we would care about would go by the board. When Dan Dennett and I were putting together a conference of mind-brain scientists, we couldn't get either of the Churchlands to come, and we couldn't get Stephen Stitch or any of the other alleged eliminative materialists to come. It is so far a pretty much dead letter, literally dead. Most of its proponents actually are no longer with us. So I don't know anybody actively defending. It doesn't look to be true. And if you think about how hard it would be to get rid of this, it doesn't look very likely it's going to be true. If it were true, that would be a very big challenge. That the disappearing self would really challenge us. Determinism has been with us for 400 years since Hobbes in the Hobbesian form. It was with us before that in predestination with the Calvinists. Most philosophers are one stripe or another of Humean compatibilists. Namely, they're of the view that in any sense in which macro-sized events are caused, and thus don't do the quantum mechanics on us, in whatever sense macro-sized events are caused, the macro-sized events that are human choices and the bodily movements they cause, those are caused too. determinism in that sense is true. Mine is the so what response, the David Hume compatibilist response. There's two branches of us, people who call themselves source compatibilists. All you need is the right source for human action to have responsibility. And then there's people like me, usually called classical compatibilists. You actually do need the ability to have acted otherwise, but it doesn't mean what you think it means in terms of having such an ability. Take the Virginia teacher that I mentioned, Mr. Ott. I think it very plausible that he was caused to have his pedophilic desires that led him to choose to touch his stepdaughter by a tumor that was in no sense his responsibility. Factors over which he had no control caused him to have the desires that he had. That leads some people to say, well, how can you blame him? But a compatibilist wants to say that's absolutely irrelevant. We all have tumors. Given the mind sciences, we all have sufficient physical causes in the brain. They may not be literal tumors. They're not sort of an object of that kind, but they're patterns of energy such that, of course, they too are sufficient causes of your choices and your behavior. We all have those kinds of causes. The relevant question for classical compatibilists is, could you have restrained them? Did you have the capacity not to act on them? So Kant says in the second critique, if you want to ask somebody whether he has a capacity to choose other than he did, his example is the lustful man who says, I can't resist my lust for that woman. Kant says, put an executioner across the street and ask him whether or not he's going to resist his impulse to go touch that woman or not. And Kant's supposing that, of course, he would. What Kant is stating is what's usually called the behavioral or counterfactual test for capacity. Namely, it doesn't ask, are there sufficient causes of your desires? It rather asks, is it the case? Had you wanted to enough, or had you chosen otherwise, or tried hard enough to restrain it, different ways of putting it, would you have succeeded? Every counterfactual has success conditions, and the counterfactual notion of ability is, if you had tried hard, which you didn't, would you have succeeded? So suppose you have a track star who lost a race and the coach said you could have won. He does not mean there were no causes sufficient for you to have lost the race. He rather means if you had tried harder, if you hadn't stayed out so late the night before with your girlfriend, if you had lengthened your stride, if you'd done 100 other things, you would have won. Abilities, capacities to do otherwise, do not have an incompatibility with sufficient causation. That's the essential move of classical compatibilism. So Mr. Ott, the relevant question is not whether his pedophilic desires were sufficiently caused by factors over which he had no control. Of course they were. Is it rather whether or not he would have restrained himself if he wanted to badly enough, if he had chosen to do so, or some other variation of these counterfactuals? He actually is an interesting case. In his case, it might well be he didn't have the capacity. That's not shown by showing that his desires were sufficiently caused. It's rather shown by the fact that his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, this was 2004, the Rangel results that we discovered in 2009, his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex was really squeezed by this tumor. And Kant's behavioral test, it was the case he was grabbing nurses and groping nurses in an inappropriate way when he knew that if he did so, he would be dropped out of the prison program, sent back to prison, lose his job, and have his wife leave him, none of which he wanted. So even though he really wanted the things he knew would come about, he was still engaged in sexually inappropriate behavior, both anatomically and behaviorally. He looks like someone who might not have had the capacity, but that's the relevant question, not simply sufficient causation. The epiphenomenal choices, the data just doesn't show it. All that happens for people like Libet and his followers who think that choices are epiphenomenal is that they're thinking when you mean choice, you mean something suspicious, like a kind of mental event that exists in time but not in space and doesn't have energy. Well, yeah, that stuff's epiphenomenal. How could it cause anything? But that's not what you mean by willing. Be a real reductionist. If willing means what's going on, for example, in the supplementary motor area of the brain, if that's what willing is, then does it cause behavior? Looks like a good scientific question for which all of the evidence is yes, from Sir John Eccles forward. So it looks like It's simply a causation. Al Mealy wrote a book called Effective Intentions. It's called The Power of the Conscious Will. It answers Wegner's title, saying, look, there's not a shred of evidence in neuroscience that choices are epiphenomenal. What there is evidence that physically realized choices operate in a causal chain. They are caused and they cause. So there's not much evidence for epiphenomenalism. It is the case, if it were true, it would often be a problem. Sometimes I think you can actually show that you can control things not by controlling how they're caused, but by controlling the horn of an epiphenomenal fork. As I said recently at a symposium on just this topic alone, I said, look, no one has to die on this hill. This is just academic speculation, because there really isn't a showing that choices are epiphenomenal with the behavior chosen. But if there were, there could still be salvaged some responsibility. Think of just a simple example. Getting a square hit on a golf ball. How do you do that? Well, you get a square hit on the golf ball by getting a good follow-through. Now, getting a good follow-through cannot cause an earlier event of getting a square hit. Yet by focusing on that, you often are told by golf pros you get a square hit. That's an epiphenomenal fork where you control one horn of the fork, and although you can't directly control the common cause, you can control the other horn. So it may be that some epiphenomena are within our control as well. The last one, what do we know about ourselves? My first book on Freud said not very much, but it doesn't matter, because if Freud is right, we come to know ourselves through therapy. This isn't the challenge here. The challenge is we're not infallible. Whoever thought we were? Are we usually wrong? If you look at Wegner's book, it's a lot of recherche experiments building on some things done by John Bargh and others on the automaticity of daily life. And yeah, there are causal influences of which we are unaware. In reaction time experiments, it is the case if you value the object that you're moving your arm forward, you're faster than if it's an object you disvalue. Those are marginal phenomena that do not show us that we don't understand the central cases of causing the behavior that we choose. So I think that one comes out false. And as to privileged access, I think there's no evidence of the lack of that either. So at the end of the day, mystery dissolved, it's all going to be fine. So now what do we do with that $15 million the MacArthur Foundation gave us to study? Well, it's what we called the little think. This was what we called the big think, or the big issues. Is neuroscience going to sink the criminal justice system? Are we going to be owned by the neuroscientists? Answer no. So now let's roll up our sleeves and do the work that neuroscience can actually help us do. The example I give is the last 70 years of the neuroscience of addiction, which is an extremely rich literature that has lots of insights, which does not show you for a moment there's no such thing as responsibility. It simply raises interesting questions about how much addiction, how much addicts can control their own addiction. Take a recent Canadian case. A nurse who was addicted to the substance that she was prescribing for her patients stole their drugs to feed her addiction. Do you prosecute her for theft? Canadian courts held the answer to that was negative. Is that the right result? Is that how addiction operates? We've got 70 years of a very rich neuroscience literature that can do a lot better than just the folk psychology and the law have done on whether or not addicts can control both their use and the behavior that gets such use, like stealing your patient's drugs. There, I think neuroscience is the handmaiden of the law, not its challenger. And it's a welcome handmaiden. It's a better psychology than we had before. Thank you for your patience. I told you I talked too fast, but I can't help myself.
Moore, for your synthesis of so mysterious for me problem. Perhaps it's a false problem. I will give the floor to everybody that would like to put questions, please. So,
Actually, I have a very naive question and very much more from a neuroscience perspective. So when I was listening to you talking about the cage, the Phineas cage, so that interests me a lot. And I was wondering about what you think about this. So I don't understand anything about law, okay? So what do you think about the criminal responsibility in adolescents, or even not so much in adolescents, but more, so we know today that brain is not mature at 16, 18, not even in 20 years. So how do you see it, this criminal responsibility?
Do you like to answer already the two questions, or? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, I think youth is really interesting because of the slow developing brain, different by the genders. One of my colleagues, Stephen Morrison, the MacArthur Project, has spent a long time on juvenile brains. At some point, you of course get sufficient maturity, but what it shows is how gradual that process is. It challenges all of the natural properties on which responsibility is based because they're all shown to be gradually accreting properties. It's not like at 16 or 18. All of a sudden, you become what the law says you are, which is a responsible adult. As I tell my law students who are all in their mid-20s, I said, you guys are barely eligible yourselves to be responsible adults because maturity, actually, as we all know, starts at about 60. But nonetheless, it's a set of attributes that gradually develop and actually continue well beyond the law's points. So what we have is this crude presumption. There's a book by a friend of mine, Leo Katz, called Why is the Law So Perverse? Namely, why is it the case, as every scientist points out, that the world is largely made up of continuous phenomena, and the law imposes two valued remedies on it? Right? It's a puzzle for the law, why it's the case that you're either guilty or not guilty, that you either have a contract or you don't have a contract. You either own the property or you don't own it. When the properties by virtue of which any of those things are true are natural properties that are on a continuous variation. His book answers, actually, it's absolutely essential for law to impose bivalent remedies on these matters of continuous phenomena, in which event there's no greater puzzle about youth than any other thing in the law. Namely, isn't it interesting that the maturing nature of moral agency is another of those things on which the law artificially draws a bright line? There is one mistake not to make, and that's, of course, the mistake with regard to heaps. Namely, just because you can't say how many stones make a heap, it should not lead you to skepticism about heaps. There really are heaps of stones, and there really are things that are not heaps of stones, even if there are a number of things where you're not sure whether it's a heap because it's more or less a heap than something else. So I don't find it particularly puzzling, other than it's a real practical problem. The odd thing our law does with youth is it actually says the seriousness of the crime can affect the eligibility for responsibility for it, which is our tried as an adult doctrines. So if you have a violent murder by a 16-year-old in most American states, even though that 16-year-old for theft would probably not be tried as an adult and subject to the responsibility of the criminal justice system, for some serious crime like murder, they would be. And I don't think that's a scientific doctrine or a legally justified one. That's just a yielding to community sentiment. Namely, for something that has a wild public outcry, we don't want someone getting off just because they're young. I don't think that's a justified attitude.
Other questions, perhaps? Marta, please.
Good afternoon. First of all, I wanted to ask you something. We are here talking about determinism and causalism and all of that, and that as an obvious relationship with the mental states. But the question is, we are always talking about mental states without saying what they actually are, because they are not the intention, they are not the causal relation, they are not the consequence, and they are actually not what comes before or after the intention or the causal relationship. So I would like to ask if it is possible to put in words what eventually are the mental states, and not as a relationship of them with the world.
I missed the word. What is officially the mental states? Is that what you said?
Exactly.
Okay. I do think the mental states officially, the same they've been for quite a while, namely the intentions with which we act and the predictive beliefs with which we act, are the ones by virtue of which the subjective culpability accompanies objective wrongdoing to make a blameworthy defendant. Those mental states are those of both intention and belief. The objects of each are what I call wrongdoing in the mind of the offender. It's not that they have to believe it's wrong, they simply have to believe it has the aspects that make it wrong to do what they're doing. In which event, one of those two representational mental states of predictive belief, usually called foresight, or intention, has as its object an action's aspects that make it wrongful. So notice the culpability that makes you makes you culpable is parasitic logically on the norms that make certain actions wrong to do. So to make someone liable, say, for murder, isn't, of course, just for a voluntary act to cause a death, but it's also for the mind of the person whose act it was to have either predicted correctly or intended that his act would have the causal property causing the death of that person. So I think there is a pretty precise official notion of the mental states that make you responsible. And I do think neuroscience is accurate in its challenging responsibility precisely at that point. I don't think it succeeds, but it's the right place to challenge. Namely, do you really have intentions and predictive beliefs? And do they have the causal efficacy that they have to have for you to have control, making you blameworthy?
But don't you think it's still a some kind of reductionist view of the mental states and what we can learn about them?
So punishment is what I missed what we're to learn. Sorry, my hearing aids don't pick up your microphone very well.
What I was asking, if you believe that that perspective, that is obviously consensual, if that belief of intention is not somehow reductionist way of looking at it still, and if we can go deeper in our analysis of the mental states, more than just call it intention or belief.
Well, you can go deeper in a number of ways. I mean, I think neuroscience goes deeper. Eventually, hopefully, we actually understand where intentions are located, and particularly how their content is formed, whether there's a language of thought in the brain or not. So deeper in that sense, to be welcomed. That just shows us more and more about what intentions really are, at least as they're realized in our physical equipment. I mean, they might be different in different creatures. If deeper means we have other mental states behind those intentions that cause it, well, there are people who think that blameworthiness depends not just on the thin notion that Kant said it depended on, namely a good will, but it also depends on the motivations that led to that will. Then you become more Aristotelian. You ask about what it is that people's character is like, namely, what kind of a person are they? Not just what did they choose at a particular moment in time, but rather what kind of a person was it that led them to make the choice. In our system, we usually relegate that to sentencing. Liability rules simply depend on whether or not someone both did something wrong and had wrongdoing as the object of an intention or a belief. I think there's a lot morally beyond simply the laws putting it all in sentencing. there's a lot more to that than meets the eye. There are these in-depth theories about what it is that make you blameworthy. I call those the theories of philosopher's disease, which is namely they don't know when to stop explaining. One of my colleagues at the University of Arizona, Gene Hampton, a fellow retributivist about punishment, died in Paris some years ago. As I said to Gene, you're making it so complicated, the mental states you have to have behind the intention, that the only people who could ever be guilty criminal defendants are philosophy professors. And surely it's not the case you have to be that sophisticated in your mental life to be blameworthy. Blameworthiness is a simple thing compared to what those kinds of analyses are. Namely, it is to do wrong with wrongdoing in your head.
Okay, thank you.
There is other questions? Vanessa, please.
First of all, thank you for your interesting lecture, Professor Murit. So it's a pleasure for all of us. My question is, taking into account the size of the amygdala of most psychopaths, do you consider that they have the capacity to act in another way, or can they resist the inner impulses?
Oh, amygdala. I thought you said liberal. So with the amygdala and the emotions, I must have missed. I'm sorry, I was misled. I thought you said a liberal society, but no, you said the amygdala. What did you want out of the emotional base in the amygdala?
Can they resist the inner impulses, the psychopaths?
Can you what?
Psychopaths can resist.
Oh yeah, no, that's a fabulously interesting question. We actually put our scanners for the MacArthur project. We had admission to scan all of the inmates of the New Mexico State Prison, a huge percentage of which are diagnosable on the standard scales as psychopaths, to see if we could find some markers in addition to the standard ones with regard to psychopathy. Part of the question about them is indeed whether they have the emotional deficits that have been for a century and a half the markers of it. Suppose that they do. The moral philosophy part is part of what it takes to be a moral agent, not just the belief, desire, intention sets that I kept referring to, but also the emotional backing for them, showing why you care about morality because you care about other people. Is that part and parcel of what it takes to make someone a moral agent? You know, Hollywood movies love that aspect of blameworthiness. So they do, with Mr. Spock on the first Star Trek series, right? The Vulcan who has no emotions. So is he a moral agent? I tend to think the answer to that is yes, but I understand the question because he gives what clinicians call that feeling of the hair on the back of your neck standing up. He's not like us. He doesn't feel what we feel. Now, they make him half human in the Star Trek series so that you can make him not a true psychopath. But suppose he were truly lacking the emotional guidance to what's required to behave morally, but he's a real good calculator, so he does just fine in his calculations. I've never resolved the question fully in my own mind, whether that's an essential piece of equipment for someone to be a moral agent. One of the cases in California that gave rise to that was a true psychopath who killed a teenager for his hamburger that he gotten from McDonald's, and said he hadn't been feeling any regret about it, Mr. Harris. I think for me, in that case, the choice without the emotion was sufficiently blameworthy that Harris deserved the death sentence that he got. But I'm not sure about other psychopaths. But I find it a fascinating topic.
The other person, please. Two other persons or more. How many colleagues would like and guests would like to put questions? Two and more? Three. Okay. Then we will end. I have also a question, please.
Hello, thank you for.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know you. Could you?
My name is João Pedro Batista. I work at the Constitutional Court.
Okay.
My question addresses the challenge of determinism. For what I understood, you accept some variation of compatibilism. My question is, it's some kind of provocative question. Isn't compatibilism a kind of cheating for a foundation of responsibility, in the way that, well, Schopenhauer famously said, man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills. And the compatibilist view, it's some kind of Kantian maneuver. It's postulating, it's like we are acting as if we had free will, but we cannot be sure about that. But for practical reasons, we act as we had it. Isn't the real challenge the incompatibilist view to a more secure foundation for real responsibility? Thank you.
Yeah, I think lawyers have been around for a long time who have what I call the old German philosopher Wehinger's as if philosophy. Well, we can treat you as if you're responsible. In America, it's Herbert Packer, the criminal sanction, Jerome Hall, the leading crim theorist of the 40s, 50s, and 60s in America. They both had what they called an as-if responsibility. They called it the first postulate of legal science is that people are free, even though science tells us they're not. Now, I chide those kinds of theories because I don't think we lawyers have that kind of autonomy from the sciences. If we need a natural fact to be true for our theories of blame, we can't pretend that it's true when we know that it isn't, just because it would be convenient to us. It would be helpful indeed if we indeed were free of causation, but we're not. It would be perhaps helpful if we weren't machines, but we are. So I'm not one of those fictionalists, as they call them, who thinks we can make do with an as-if responsibility. It is true that the kind of Humean compatibilism that I and many philosophers have, Kant was actually quite aware of, and he called us all it was all a wretched subterfuge is the usual translation. It's a wretched subterfuge because you're not really dealing with the fact that a will that's fully caused can't will itself, right? You're not really dealing with that. We beg to disagree, particularly if the alternative is to imagine a noumenal world where we're free, although in the phenomenal world we're not. If that's the Kantian alternative, we better go find something else to do. That's really a wretched subterfuge, it seems to me. But in any event, you say, well, you can will your actions, but you don't will your willings. I defend in my classical compatibilism two abilities you have to have. One is the ability to have done an action other than you did, meaning you would have done it if you had chosen to do so. That's as old as G.E. Moore, 1912. But the second is this one, that you would have chosen other than you did if you had wanted to badly enough, the second counterfactual. The second is the free will. The first is the free action counterfactual. I think you need both of those abilities. And then I believe you really are responsible. But notice that second ability is just another counterfactual, namely, what would you choose if you had the desires different than you did? And it really is David Hume, except it's not wretched. Hume, if you can get through your actions what you most want in this world, who cares if your choices and actions are caused by other factors? If you can get what you want, why would you concern yourself with a freedom you manifestly don't have? I think the answer is we don't and we shouldn't. But this is a real responsibility. You've got both of the capacities, if you're a blameworthy agent, both the capacity to act other than you did if you chose to do so, and the capacity to choose other than you did if you wanted to. I think you need both of those. Now, what people often do with that is say, well, then how about a third capacity? Why not a capacity to desire other than you did? Well, because I don't think you need that capacity for responsibility. Compatibilism is essentially, I think, correct in its assertion. You're responsible for what you choose and what you do, because those you have the capacity to choose and do otherwise. You're not responsible for your desires. They are mostly things that you do not control. They come from God knows where. Your second order desires to will yourself into certain kinds of people have limited success, as we all know. But the trick is whether or not you chose to do something on those desires and whether you did it because of that choice. So compatibilism draws the line very sharply, just one level back from where you thought we were. It's not just free action, it's also free willing.
I think, João, okay, and after, I don't know if another person to close the, okay, João, please.
Hello. Thank you for your lecture. I have a question. Your conclusion is that neuroscience does not pose a real challenge to criminal liability or responsibility. However, you also said that a certain morality and a certain psychology underlies the law, and the psychology is what you called folk psychology. And you gave us an example. Why are we here? And your answer was that, well, I wanted to know something about mental states and criminal responsibility. I believed that you knew something about that, so I decided to come. But that was not the way it really happened. I really just received an email and I said, wow, I want to be there. And that was the decision. So based on my personal history, based on your books that I've read, and based on the things about you that I've heard, the decision just popped out. So that was not a rational scheme. It was, I did not make a practical syllogism. It was just something that pops out from the things that I knew about you. So my question is this. Even so, the neuroscience and psychology does not pose a real challenge to responsibility. Does it pose a real challenge to the psychology that underlies responsibility? Because the decisions of our courts are based on the practical syllogisms. So they assume that I'm here because I thought I want to know something about that. I believe that you know something about that, so I decide. And that's not real. That was not the way it happened. So my first question is, does it pose, in your opinion, a real challenge to folk psychology, the psychology that underlies responsibility? And second, if the answer is yes, do you believe it is a big question, using your terms? Do you believe it's a big question or one of the small questions that we are going to then take care? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for the compliment of listening so closely. Your recapitulation of my lecture sounded very accurate and familiar. I agreed with every word of it. I like your phenomenology of it just popped out. I got to go there, right? Your analogy to judging, you know, there is this theory of judging. Hutchison, the hunch it's called, the theory of judicial decision, 1927, Cornell Law Quarterly. Namely, judges don't have full practical syllogisms. They just hunch it, right? They listen to the facts and they know the decision. Then they have to write these damn opinions, so they look up the law and figure out the connecting premises. Both you and Hutchison, you about your decision and Hutchison about judges. It's what Aristotle says. You know practical syllogisms so well that the most elliptical reference to a part of it fills in the rest implicitly. You don't need to articulate it. So I sat in Westwood, where I was teaching at USC in Los Angeles once. I sat next to Leonard Nimoy, who played Mr. Spock on that television show, Star Trek, because I wanted to listen to whether or not he sounded as pedantically silly as he does on the show. And why does he sound pedantically silly? Because he gives a full articulation of both his theoretical and his practical syllogisms, and we're both good enough deductive logicians and practical reasoners. None of us need that. So if you say, why did I take an umbrella? And somebody says, it's raining. That's all we need. The whole syllogism is there, and it was there for you too. Namely, you wanted not to get wet. You believed that it was raining, and therefore, without an umbrella, you would get wet. But if you took the umbrella, you would not get wet, and therefore, you intended to take the umbrella. Because of that intention, you took it. We don't need any of that. The whole thing is so familiar. It's in your head. So the phenomenology simply misleads. What you know so well isn't evidence of its non-existence. It's evidence of its omnipresence. So it would be a real challenge if indeed that psychology were challenged by neuroscience, but I think it's not. I do think it's easy to get misled by sort of things popping out. I mean, there are things, decisions like that. Daniel Wegner in his book gives William James-like examples. Remember William James, Principles of Psychology, 1890. Talks about, he says, stand on the edge of a cliff and without any further thought, you start leaning over the edge. Now, there are idiomotor actions, as James called them, where we don't have full practical syllogisms, where you simply have a cause in a mental state, maybe in this case, fear of falling, that causes you actually to do just the thing that puts that fear in real terms. Another example, you really want to beat some chess master in chess. That desire causes your heart rate to go up. It's not that you've got any belief, desire, intention set, but the desire is causally operative. So I don't want to deny cases where it just pops out. I don't think your coming to my lecture was like your heart beating. I actually think you made a decision, and even though the premises were quite submerged, you could fully articulate them. And hopefully neuroscience would actually find their correlates in your brain.
Hello, Professor. Thank you for your lecture. When you were talking about the two abilities that we should have to be blameworthy, when you gave the example of the nurse who took the meds from her patients, she might have those two abilities, but is that enough? Because a person with an addiction, maybe in some cases, is not in an equal position to other people. She might have the abilities in the rudimental state, but is that enough to have criminal responsibility as an equal?
Yeah, no, those are the right questions about addicted persons. What kind of capacities do they have to choose other than they did if they wanted to enough and to act in light of their choices? 100 pages of this book goes into both of those capacities. How much do they actually have? The evidence with regard to addiction is from the economists. It's highly elastic demand curve. Namely, it looks like they are quite responsive to price, for example, in which event looks like some choosing going on that's desire responsive. But that's not conclusive evidence. One would want to see both the behavioral evidence and hopefully someday the neuroscience. What I find fascinating about the studies on addiction is for 50 years, and I think it's still taught in American medical schools, the old dopamine flooding of the nucleus accumbens stuff, sort of guided from Milner and Olds in 1954, with the rats pressing the bar, right? There was this notion that drugs hijacked the limbic system and made it impossible for us to choose or do other than we actually did if we're addicts. I think that one has gone by the board, and that's gone by the board from neuroscience itself. Even its progenitor in America, Roy Wise, 50 years in, said, I do not believe the dopamine hypothesis explains behavior. So at the University of Michigan, for example, the psychology department on addiction says it's not a pleasure center. What's really going on is the rewiring of the brain by continued uses of opioids that is separating the liking system from the wanting system. So what addicts report in terms of liking their experiences with drugs less and less doesn't diminish the motivating force thus the wanting of the drugs. And what's odd about addicts is this divorce of liking from wanting. Those are two different systems. And the drugs seem to affect the one without affecting the other, which is odd. Usually we want what we like and we like what we want. Satisfaction states reinforce our wants. And if we want something, we predict that we will be satisfied when we get it. But they're not the same thing. So we do have some explanations. Does that make someone less responsible? Well, as I say in the book, it does make them less rational. It gives them one less way of controlling themselves. Namely, the dislike of the experience does not incentivize non-doing the experience. They don't have the same tools the rest of us have. Quite true.
Thanks. Oh, there is two other questions and three questions. No, two questions. Okay, then we will end. I have a question also, please.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sara.
Could you say your name and
Yes,
from
yes.
where
I was
you
just
come?
about to, yes. My name is Sara. I'm a PhD candidate from Belgrade in the field of legal philosophy. So first of all, thank you very much for the excellent lecture. I really enjoyed it. I completely agree with your stance on compatibilism. I just have two questions regarding your answer to the counterexample from the perspective of incompatibilism. Basically, as far as I know and as far as I understand, if we have the premise of determinism, the actual reality is the only possible reality, in a sense that everything had to be determined by the causal chain. So I'm wondering, and I would like to hear a bit more about your argument, and I haven't read the books, and I'm looking forward to it, but before that, how can you explain from the perspective of determinism what you named free willing, in the sense that if we can make a conceptual distinction between a consequentialist stance towards responsibility, in a sense that when we punish someone, we influence the further future causal chain of their behavior in a way, and that's something I completely understand, especially from the legal perspective. But I'm wondering about the, let's call it, the ontological perspective of something that, as far as I know, some philosophers call the ultimate responsibility. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but I can understand the consequentialist influence on the further behavior. But I'm wondering about the ultimate responsibility from the perspective of determinism. And the second question concerns Libet's experiments. It was quite puzzling to me, and all authors mentioned this, that there is a concept of a veto as somewhere in the process of making a decision. I think he also mentions this. When the brain reacts, there is a possibility to stop making a decision that was previously enabled. And I haven't heard many interpretations on the concept of this veto. So I was just wondering if you could give us a little bit more input on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah, well-informed questions. The second, quickly, it is true about Libet himself and some of the wild Libetans, as I call them, that Libet thought you had a veto function. And using stop-action experiments, that there was about a 100 millisecond window between onset of awareness of willing and the ability to stop the action willed. People have called that it's not free will, it's free won't. But even his most ardent followers, like Patrick Haggard in London, point out that, of course, the veto function, although it exists, itself has causal antecedents. It doesn't get you out of determinism problem. Libet himself speculates that maybe the free won't is somehow free of the brain influence. Why would that possibly be? In which event it too is determined. So it doesn't help the problem. That there is a veto function leaves the problem for us compatibilists to solve there, as well as with regard to the initial willing. So with regard to the deep or real or whatever responsibility we deontologists believe, I was introduced at a speech some years ago by one of my former students. She said, and Moore is the modern voice of retributivism. Sounds like Radio Free Europe or something. I have been, for most of my career, one of those real responsibility guys with regard to punishment, retributivism, and also a determinist. So how do I get those together? Well, by the compatibilism that I thought you had some sympathy for. I mean, from David Hume onward, half of philosophy thinks it's enough for responsibility if you can cause the objects of your choices and you can choose in line with the objects of your desires. If you can choose what you most want and act as you choose, then you're responsible without regard to causal antecedents. Usually called source compatibilism, because if the source is right, nothing else matters for responsibility. In particular, sort of the causal antecedents of that source don't matter. I think that's partly true, but classical compatibilists do want something else. People who are source compatibilists can be deep theorists of responsibility, retributivists too. There's nothing incompatible there. It's just I happen to think asking for the principle of alternative possibilities to be satisfied is a good thing to have as well. You're right about possibility. If it turned out that determinism was incompatible with possibilities, then it's what Aristotle argued against the Mengerians of his own time, the actualists, namely the only thing possible is the actual. Well, that just ain't how we use the word possible, right? You got it wrong in terms of what possibilities must be, is Aristotle's kind of response. It cannot be that it has to be actual to be possible, because possibility should be the halo of might have beens around what actually was in terms of our thoughts about possibility. So in that sense, possibility is like other words like capacity and ability. We're going to give it a counterfactual reading. It won't be inconsistent with it not being actual. We have to do that. That's what we mean. So notice this is a compatibilist move, just like the move with regard to the capacity to do otherwise. Namely, it has nothing to do with being sufficiently caused by antecedent events over which you have nothing to do. It rather has to do with what would have happened in close possible worlds to the actual world. So that possibility uses Leibniz's notion of a possible world to say, in a world very much like ours, this wouldn't have happened. So I went to one of the advantages of being at the best engineering school in the world, which the University of Illinois thinks it is I went to a lecture as to why the I-39 bridge fell into the Mississippi about a decade ago. And a structural engineer gave a beautiful layer by layer explanation, from environmental variables through molecular explanations through atomic structures, as to why the bridge fell when it fell. So he gave us sets of sufficient conditions for that bridge to fall when it did. But at the end of his lecture, he said, it could have held. What did he mean it could have held? He certainly didn't mean it was not sufficiently caused to fall when it fell. He meant in a slightly different possible world, with a little bit different in the design of the bridge, a little bit different on the load that the construction crews placed on the bridge, a little bit different temperature. Without the confluence of those factors, the bridge would not have fallen. That has nothing to do with an incompatibility with determinism. In which event it's a compatibilism about bridges having capacities. Hume does the same thing for human beings. So you can be as deep as you want, not Hume. You can be Kant. You don't have to have Ding an sich and noumena. You can be Humean. It's not wretched. It's probably right. Namely, you can be as deontologist as you like. I'm one of those too. And one of these kinds of compatibilists. So welcome to the club.
Another question?
Hope I'm heard well. My name is Igor. I'm a PhD candidate in philosophy in Poland. I'm going to be brief. So the question is, Professor, how do you really distinguish between eliminativism and reductionism? I do find this topic tricky. Like, for example,
what's the first word? You said something, and reductionism.
Yeah, between eliminativism and reductionism. I do find it tricky, especially given the fact that some philosophers use eliminativism as a sort of reductionism. Like, for example, when I read Derek Parfit, he distinguishes between constitutive reductionism, identifying and eliminative. And I remember actually your point, which was sort of hilarious, or in your paper, Moral Reality Revisited, when you talked about reduction of water to H2O. And I remember the answer, like, we do not really eliminate water because if we did, then H2O would disappear. After all, they're identical. And I was wondering, then, if you do reduce mental states to brain states, why not you eliminate the mental states? I mean, yeah, well, basically, what's the difference? Probably, like, I hope it's a well-formed question, but I do find it tricky. So what basically distinguishes between eliminativism and reductionism in a nutshell?
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Now, it's a good question. How much time do you have? Because look, I left off in about 1963 on the nature of scientific reduction, Ernst Nagel's Structure of Science. What's happened since is that the two kinds of reduction have been separated, so that with Fodor and Putnam in the 60s and 70s, you don't get simple identities of mental states and brain states, you get multiple realizability. Namely, every mental state can be multiply realized by various brain states. And then you get supervenience, namely you get covariance, so that it's asymmetrical covariance. Namely, you can have a different mental state, you'll have to have a different physical state, but not vice versa, because they can be multiply realized, right? And then you get functional specifications, namely as your initial research program, you functionally specify the kinds of states this physical system would have to have the molar functioning that it does have. And then you add token identity, which is what gives you physicalism. Namely, the subtypes are identical to brain states, but the whole brain state is only identical to a disjunction, a disjunctive whole of all the ways in which that brain state can be multiply realized. Now we've got a complex reductionism. And then there's another story that goes like this, but it can't get too complex. So people who are what I call radical multiple realizability theses think that any sort of, there's an infinite number of brain states that can realize any mental state. I'm with people like Jaegwon Kim, the Korean philosopher. That can't be right. There's a finite number of brain states in human brains that can realize, say, an intention to go downtown. And even if it's large, it's not infinite. In which event you get what Kim says there's two kinds of reductions in that scheme. Namely, each subtype of brain state is identical to this subtype of mental state, and the whole mental state is identical to the disjunction of those subtypes. That is, it's still reductionist. Now, the interesting feature is the explanatory priority of the mental that can survive that kind of metaphysics. Namely, even though we're all just two valued switches going on and off in complicated patterns, nonetheless, the level of explanatory salience remains the mental. The upper level explanation does better work than the lower level, even though the lower level is ontologically more basic. That's how one, I think, gets those things together. It's a reductionism of a sort, but one that allows the mental level, it's not going anywhere, it's explanatorily necessary. It's like, in a way, it's like temperature. Once people saw this for this, they went back to sort of reductions like classical thermodynamics. It doesn't take for a temperature to be at a certain level any particular configurations of molecules of a gas. A very large variety of their interactions will do, as long as they have the same mean kinetic energy, right? How they're actually moving turns out not to be explanatorily interesting. It's physically determining in the particular case, not explanatory interest. What's interesting is something that you can state using the upper level phenomenon, the higher level phenomenon, temperature. Namely, temperature is what's doing the work in measuring how it varies with pressure. Even though it's ontologically quite diverse and so forth. So the same for mental states. The claim, at least, is, and I was trying not to be too smug about it, because it's not obvious, but I do believe I think it is obvious, actually. It is the case mental state explanations will remain, despite their physical base. There's no logical necessity of that. I think that's how the science will work out.
I have also a question. It's not so different from the last one. As a matter of fact, two questions in one. One about something objective.
About what?
About what your system, about your system, the inspiration that your system gave us. Why and how do you need in law, in criminal law, mental states? The problem is not if ontological the mental states exists or not, but if it's better to consider mental states or not in the perspective of justice and equality and other things. And this question is in relationship with my final question. There's something that I retired from your book, this one, doubt. Moral responsibility, criminal responsibility in your system doesn't depend on character, personality. It's not based on shoes, but on what we are. But you said that what we are, we don't decide. We don't decide about our desires. Well, okay. But then we are responsible for what we are. And so.
I take it that question is incredulity. Are you kidding? We're responsible for what we are, although we don't control it? Yeah, you got it. That's right. That is the compatibilist notion. It is also the case that there is a long-standing debate between Aristotelians and Kantians as to what the desert base is for responsibility. And no Aristotelian is going to let Kant get away with just saying it's choice to do wrong. They're going to want to do character analysis. They're going to want to say, no, it depends what kind of person you are. That's revealed by your choices. Even David Hume fell into that one. That's just a debate that I'm on one side of, and you seem to have sympathy for the other side. Namely, what does it take to be blameworthy with respect to a bad result? Is it enough that you caused it by your voluntary actions when that's precisely what you chose to do? Or does your choice itself have to be coming from bad character, right? Now notice we choice people can build in all kinds of conditions of justification and excuse. We don't have to be simple-minded about the things that can affect choice, either your capacity to have made the choice or the particular factors that make the choice more reasonable, justifications. We do all that stuff, that we can do. But what we don't do is ask whether that choice sprang from an evil character. We simply think it's enough that you made the choice. So your first question was, why does the criminal law care about mental states? It's an embarrassment, isn't it, to a criminal system if it has what in America we call strict liability statutes, namely statutes where there is no mental state requirement. You're liable if you sell poisoned meat, even if you had no idea and no reason to know that it's poisoned under the Pure Food and Drug Act. You're strictly liable because you did the voluntary act that caused the meat to be in the condition that it's prohibited by the statute. You did the actus reus, as the lawyer said. You do the wrong, but you didn't have the wrong in your mind. You had no culpability. I would take that to be an unfair punishment because, and I think in America, it's usually a punishment that has to be less than a year or the statute won't pass muster. It's an unfair punishment because you didn't make the choice to do wrong. That's just like running over a child that runs out in front of your car when you had absolutely nothing wrong with your driving. It's an accident in which you are causally involved, but why should that make you blameworthy? I think the answer is you're not. And if you're not blameworthy, then either on a retributivist punishment theory or a mixed punishment theory, you ought not to be punished. Now, utilitarians have their own story. So in chapter 13 of Bentham's book, The Principles of Morals and Legislation, Bentham says, well, there are cases, as he calls it, unmeet for punishment. And one of his examples are examples where you're not at fault for why it is you have caused certain wrongdoing. Namely, it's the case that the law can get no deterrent grip on you. And if you're a utilitarian, you're trying to incentivize good behavior with criminal sanctions. It won't happen if the person doesn't choose to be wrong and has no reason to think the behavior might be wrong. There's nothing you want him to do other than he did in terms of thinking. Criminal sanctions have to operate in the mind of the actor to get deterrence, in which event a utilitarian should also not want to punish in these cases. There are answers to Bentham, and that's usually what justifies strict liability statutes. Namely, you seem to get an increment of deterrence if the person can't lie about their mental states, because then they know there's no chance they're going to get off. So you maximize deterrence by not requiring mental states. Some people find that argument persuasive. But I think the requirement of mental states follows directly from criminal law, caring about moral responsibility.
Okay, that we can always do otherwise when we have a strong will, something like that. When you have work for it, we can always do better. You give an example. Someone that said that he could do otherwise if he have an effort to do otherwise with strong will. You believe that that is the solution to
No, I'm
justify-
not someone who thinks we always has the capacity to do better. I think that's a relevant question to which the answer is often yes, but it's not always yes. So take Kant's executioner, the person who says he can't control his sexual passions. That may well be true for certain sexual predators, but then ask Kant's kind of question. Give that person the incentive to do better, make him really lose something that he most wants, if he doesn't restrain that, and see if he restrains it. If he doesn't restrain it, then he really can't do better.
It's a preventive retribution. It's a preventive retribution. It's to work with the retribution to know, not as an end, but as a mean to solve a question. The retribution is not the justifying of the sanction, but not what justifies the sanction, but it is some utility to know if he is responsible.
A condition of desert is indeed, I think, this capacity to have chosen and to do otherwise. That's true. So, but it is nonetheless, you can be as Kantian as you like, it is the will that makes you blameworthy, but the will only operating in certain conditions. Namely, did it have the capacity to do better, measured in the way that we've just mentioned, and not everybody has such a will, and not all the time. I don't know the strength of your own will, but I think you're probably responsible for what you just said, because you could have said something else. I think that's a pretty easy judgment to reach.
I could, of course, but the problem is the justice of all that. Because there are different opportunities. There is a justice, a problem of justice, of equality, and of opportunity, and of the milieu, the context, social context, family, and the country, and so on.
But here's the thing about responsibility. It is shot through with what philosophers call moral luck. I mean, it's just shot through with it. If you try to have a luck-free blameworthiness, then there's no such thing. Okay. So there is, as you just mentioned, what's called opportunity luck. I really want to go rob that armored car, but I can't find the damn thing to rob it. I didn't get the opportunity to exercise my bad intention. That's purely beyond my control, whether I get such an opportunity. But nonetheless, if I do get it and rob it, I'm going to be blameworthy for it. So I have opportunity luck. I have constitutive luck, constituting me the kind of person who would choose to rob an armored car. I even have the luck in forming my intentions. I could have had a sneezing fit that kept me from forming the intention, which I didn't have. Tom Nagel gives the example, even when you put a bullet at the guy, a gun at the guy's head and pull the trigger and blow his brains out, you couldn't actually control his death because, his example, a giant bird might have swooped in and taken the bullet. It didn't, but it could have, and you don't control it. So you clearly have some luck involved. Mm-hmm. All of those are true, but I think harmless truths. I think you're struck by the fact about you can't control your character. Therefore, how could you be blamed for it? Well, if I were a character theorist, I would say there what I say about all these other things. Luck is everywhere. Don't be afraid of there being luck. It's everywhere.
Dear Professor, it's not only the impossibility of control myself or someone control himself or herself. is also the problem of not everybody has the same possibilities, the same social opportunities, familiar opportunities to develop the control. Some have a psychologist or psychologists, or don't have. Is something different that comes from outside, not only from inside. But I understood very well, I think, what you have said. And the mystery here is to be solved, and to the mystery of responsibility. I could give the name, not mental states, but the mystery of responsibility by Michael Moore. And I must, I appreciate a lot the conference and the questions and dialogue that we have here. But we must read not only this book, but the work of Professor Moore, and continue our dialogue with him. Muito obrigada pela presença de todos. Foi o princípio, ou o desenvolvimento também de outras investigações, portanto, foi uma grande oportunidade por termos aqui o autor de grandes obras extremamente importantes, que nos fazem pensar sobre o que somos, o que podemos, e também sobre os fundamentos da responsabilidade moral e da responsabilidade criminal. Portanto, muito obrigada a todos pela vossa participação. Professor Moore, thank you very much.